Now, in this presentation, I want to go over with you what are the main changes that have happened to Ireland over the last 2.5 to 3 decades. So I think, being honest about it, we can all acknowledge that there's been dramatic changes that have occurred in Ireland over the last few decades. But I think that most people don't really know the steps that are involved. They don't really know exactly what happened and exactly how it happened and why it happened. Now, the why I'm going to look at in another video, hopefully in the next week or so. But let's just look first of all at how Ireland has changed so radically over the last few decades. Let's take a look here. So what really began to change, not just Ireland, but much of Western Europe, much of the Western world, the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, places like this, it really was set in motion by these global free trade agreements. Okay, there was GATT, WTO, NAFTA, and of course the EU. And these various trade agreements were all about making it easier to trade between different countries. Okay, so eliminating or at least reducing tariffs and subsidies. But the biggest border of all, if you like, to use that pun, was the borders themselves. So basically, businesses wanted to be able to freely trade between different countries without worrying about borders in between. And it could be said that the real goal of all this was actually not freedom of movement of trade or capital, if you like, but people. So the freedom of movement for people. And the idea of this is that you would be able to either outsource your work to countries where labor and costs were cheap, like the Far East, like Eastern Europe, India, China, Indonesia, etc. But not just that, you could also import people from those countries. You could bring people in from those countries, people who are willing to work for much less than your domestic population. And in that way, you can make much bigger profits than before. So that really was what the age of global free trade was about. That's really what it was all about, making big money for businesses. Okay, and also increased revenue for governments as well. That's a big part of it too. So that's really what was going on in regards to these global free trade agreements. And these agreements kind of came in, they kind of began in the 70s, and we got a bit more of it in the 80s, and then the 90s is when it really kicked in. And in terms of, well, I guess you could say the late 90s into the 2000s was when we began to see, the serious impacts of our changing demography, which really was kicked off by these free trade agreements and our participation in the EU. Now, there was one particular aspect of our involvement in the EU, our membership of the EU, which really affected us, and I'll come to that in the next slide. So I'm talking here about EU enlargement, okay, the role of the EU. So that's a mistake there to start. That should be 1981. That's when Greece joined the EU. Ireland, of course, joined in 1973 along with the UK and Denmark. And these initial, enlargements to the EU with Greece in 1981, Spain and Portugal in 86, East Germany in 1990, and then Austria, Finland and Sweden in 95. They didn't have huge impacts on Ireland really. There was some impact, you could say, from 1986, Spain and Portugal. We did start to see Spanish people coming into Ireland then, in the late 80s into the early 90s. You could see them, whether they be students or whether it was working in multinationals who were starting to come into Ireland at that point in time. I did begin to notice it myself. There was an increase in the Spanish population, but it was nothing to be too worried about at that point in time anyway, back in the late 80s, early 90s. But the real seismic impact on Ireland came from the 2004 enlargement. That was the EC10 countries of Eastern Europe, of the former Russian states of Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and then down into the Southeast Europe as well, down into a little bit later on Bulgaria and Romania. But mostly we're talking about Eastern European countries here, the EC10. Now let's just talk a little bit about what led up to that. You had the Nice Treaty, and the Nice Treaty was in 2002, and this was put to Ireland in a referendum, and initially we rejected it. But what happened was the EU were not happy with that. The EU and indeed the Irish political establishment were not happy with that. And basically our initial decision, our initial result on that, where we said no, was rejected. The EU threw it out and they said, no, we don't like that answer. We want you to vote again. You haven't given us the right answer, Ireland. You've been a bold boy. You've actually exercised your democratic right and you've said no, but we don't respect your democratic decision. Therefore, we're going to screw around with the rules. We're going to play around with the rules. We're going to break the rules, actually, and we're going to force you to vote again. And that's what happened. So then, with the help of a compliant media and with the help, of course, of the political establishment, Ireland was frog-marched. We were coerced into voting yes the second time round in the Nice Treaty. The result being that basically those EC10 countries would have freedom of movement into Ireland, and not just Ireland but the UK as well, from 2004 onwards. So despite the fact that there were ordinary people who were genuinely worried that we would have a huge influx of people coming in from these much cheaper countries where wages were significantly less, 3 or 4 times less than in Ireland, there were serious concerns that this would have a big impact on Ireland. We could see really significant numbers of people coming into Ireland from those countries. The likes of Dick Roche and Prunches de Rossa in particular, these two people, and several in the media and so on, they basically ridiculed, they shamed, they poured scorn on ordinary Irish people who had genuine, reasonable concerns about this. And sure enough, what happened in the years following this, 2005, 2006, especially in the start of 2007, we saw huge numbers coming in. In 2006, there was over 100,000 people that came in from these EC10 countries into Ireland. And of course, you've got the knock-on impact on, on wages, on jobs, like these are serious considerations, but basically Irish people were not allowed to have those concerns. We were shamed for having those concerns. This is how our political leaders at the time, this is how our media, our solicitors, our economists, this is how they so badly let us down. And we're still dealing with the fallout of those decisions today. Now, subsequent enlargements, 2007, Bulgaria, Romania, Croatia, these also did have impacts on Ireland in terms of our labour market, in terms of wages and so on, but not as seismic as the EC10, enlargement, with those EC10 countries coming in 2004. And like I said, it was the Nice Treaty that laid the foundation for that. And that's really where Ireland was screwed over by the people who should have been looking after us. There was also some concerns here, Romania in particular, in regard to the Roma population, which did increase significantly from 2007 onwards. And there were knock-on effects there in terms of, to some extent, some antisocial activity. There was an increase in crime and embezzlement and this kind of thing going on, which was to a significant extent coming from the Roma population who had moved in from these countries. And again, we're still dealing with those problems today. Now, some people might not like what I'm saying here, but this is a fact. You only need to look at the stats, the official government stats, to see what I'm talking about. And the increases in crime in regard to certain areas of the community. I'm not just making this up. This actually did happen. And this was the fallout from these enlargements of the EU and Ireland's decision to basically just go along with this and not protect its own people. So, asylum seekers and direct provision. So what am I talking about here? Well, basically from the 90s onwards, our economy began to grow, the mid-90s onwards. As our economy grew, so did the number of asylum seekers. So it's interesting that we didn't really have a problem with asylum seekers coming in significant numbers before our economy began to grow. So basically, it could be said that once people saw that there was money to be made in Ireland, once people saw that there was a higher standard of living in Ireland, that there was higher welfare benefits, interestingly, we then began to see a significant jump in the number of asylum seekers coming. And once we got to the turn of the millennium, the numbers coming were so significant that really we had to have some sort of system in place to deal with them. And that's where the direct provision system came in. It provided accommodation, it provided meals, it provided a certain amount of money each week, it provided a medical card. It looked after certainly the basic needs of these people coming in, presenting as asylum seekers. Now the problem being, of course, that many of these people were simply not genuine, and if you look at the countries they were coming from places like Pakistan and Nigeria. In recent times, you've like the likes of Albania and Georgia, the Zambia, Zimbabwe, etc. It became very clear that these were not legitimate asylum seekers. But the problem being that the legal profession were completely on board with this. And, a big part of this is because they were making money out of it. So you had all these repeat applications for refugee status, and they were being thrown out by the courts. But it didn't matter because you could just keep repeating and repeating and repeating, and eventually after a number of years what tends to happen is the people who've come in presenting as asylum seekers, they get to be in the direct provision system, and eventually they're just let stay. After a few years, the Department of Justice, they just say, you know what, let's just let them stay. If they haven't committed any obvious crimes apart from the fact of actually fraudulently presenting as asylum seekers, we're just going to let them stay. We're just going to let the Irish people pay for their accommodation, pay for their meals, pay for the medical expenses, pay for the education costs of their children. That's all fine, apparently. All those, hundreds of millions of euro each year, that's all fine and well because the Irish people will look after them. You can see how corrupt this whole system is. But unfortunately, it's let continue. And it's oversubscribed. The problem is getting worse and worse because what's happening is people from these countries, people from parts of Southeast Europe, from the Balkans, people from parts of Africa and Asia, they can see that Ireland is a soft touch in this sense. We are not enforcing our own rules, and because of that, there's huge incentives for people to come and pretend to be asylum seekers. And they can also get in the housing ladder. They can bring in family members, and eventually they can get Irish citizenship. And if you manage to get refugee status, which many of them do tend to get in the end, you can get your Irish citizenship for free instead of having to pay €1,000 like most people do who come in legally. So you can see how wrong the whole system is. Like, we are incentivizing people trafficking. You've got this impact on the housing situation as a result, because you've all these people who've come in through the back door into Ireland, and yet we allow them to come in, and we really incentivize people trafficking, people smuggling. And then you've got the knock-on effect in rural areas, particularly, where you have these direct provision centres which are set up against the will of the people, without any consent from the people, forced it on the people. The media then join in. The media join in shaming and ridiculing these ordinary Irish people, calling them like far right, simply for wanting their democratic right, for saying, hang on a second, we're not happy with this. You can't just come in and force a centre on the local people without consulting them, without asking them if they want them. But that's what's going on. You can see just how unjust this whole situation is. Now, another aspect of all of this was birthright citizenship and the 27th Amendment. So basically, after the Good Friday Agreement came in the late 90s, there was a loophole in Irish law which meant that anyone born on the island of Ireland automatically became an Irish citizen. So we're talking after 1998 onwards really. We began to see heavily pregnant women from abroad, now mostly from Africa, and there were certain African countries in particular. Quite a few came from Nigeria, for instance. And they began arriving in increasing numbers to avail of this said loophole in the system. Now, not surprisingly, after a few years of this, our maternity hospitals were becoming dangerously overcrowded. So we had overburdened doctors and nurses calling for help due to these overstretched and dangerous overcrowding in maternity hospitals, and particularly places like the Rotunda, were massively overcrowded, and it was becoming very dangerous, for the women themselves and for other women in these maternity hospitals. it was just a crazy situation and something had to be done. So basically, the government ministers of the time listened to them and realized we had to do something. We had to protect the country. We had to protect the people of this country. And not only that, we had a certain duty towards the other members of the EU as well, because we had people coming in here through the back door, availing of this loophole in order so that their child would become an Irish citizen. Once they were born in Ireland, the child was automatically an Irish citizen. And it was a way, of course, for the mother to also get Irish citizenship, and then any future members of the family would also get Irish citizenship too. So this really was quite a dishonest way, of exploiting the country, exploiting the system. And like I said, many women did avail of that, mostly African women. And, you can see the legacy today because you can see many of the prominent African academics and political figures in Ireland from that time, who came into Ireland between the years of 98 and 2004. A large percentage of them came in through the back door, came in, exploited the system, exploited this loophole in Irish law to make sure they had a child who became an Irish citizen automatically. So an anchor baby, as it's called. That's what was going on. Really a very dishonest way of getting into the country. But, you have people like T.J. Kangara, Yvonne Joseph. There's, I can't think, there's quite a few of the different, like I said, African political candidates. You're talking, people in academia, in politics, in public life over the last number of years. The ones that came in between 98 and 2004 and who used a baby in order to be allowed to stay in the country and to get Irish residency and citizenship, a lot of them came in via this backdoor, this loophole in the Irish law. An exploitative situation, if truth be told. So what basically happened in 2004, the government ministers at the time realized we had to do something about this. The 27th Amendment referendum came in 2004. The people of Ireland recognized we had to do something about this situation. This was plain exploitation. We had to protect the people of this country. We had to protect the people of the EU as well, because this wasn't allowed anywhere in the EU. And this is something to be aware of. When you hear people like Kieran Cuddihy and other people in the media and in politics talking about, this racist referendum 2004, they haven't got a clue what they're talking about. Okay? I remember it. I remember clearly back then. I remember what was going on. I remember the doctors and nurses at that time, calling out, really pleading for something to be done. This was basically a matter of humanity. It was a case of, do you want to look after the doctors and nurses of this country and also the women coming in? Do you care about those people? Okay, people like Kieran Cuddihy obviously didn't. But thankfully, over 79% of the Irish population did care about these people and did realise we had to do something about it. So we closed that loophole, brought Ireland into line with the rest of the EU. No other country in the EU allowed this exploitation of their citizens, allowed this absolute exploitation of the people of this country. And so therefore, we closed that loophole. We prevented any further abuse of our citizenship laws. And thankfully, we haven't had to face that situation again because the people quite rightly decided to close off that exploitative loophole in Irish law at the time. So let's move on a little bit further. Recession and post-recession. So the highest ever immigration into Ireland, this happened really in the years just prior to the crash. So we're talking 2006, 2007, when you had over 100,000 migrants coming into Ireland per year. Particularly in 2006 and in the first half of 2007, the numbers were really off the scale. And this was due to due to the Nice Treaty, us signing that under duress in 2002, and the enlargement of the EU in 2004 with the East European countries joining the EU and Ireland having no restrictions on the freedom of movement for those countries. Now the crash happened 2007, 8, 9, etc. It kind of came to an end about 2012, 13. So the numbers of people coming in came down significantly during the recession years, but they did pick up again post 2013 onwards. And we're talking about 50,000 new migrants each year arriving into the country now. And obviously you're going to have impacts on rent, because the more people in the country, that's going to have a knock-on impact on rents. And rents have been rising year on year in recent times. And a big part of that is because we have this open door to the EU. We also have the situation with people coming in increasing numbers presenting as asylum seekers. We have other people exploiting the visa language school situation. We have people coming in on work permits and employment permits, technically legally, but there's no need for these people really, because what's happening is recruitment companies are going around, scouting around outside the EU, essentially looking for cheap labour, looking for people to come in and work for less than the people of this country. Okay, so it's a way of undermining the labour market. It's a way of placing a downward pressure on wages. So, you can't really be in favour of that. It's not good for the people of this country. So we're seeing an impact on housing lists. We're seeing an impact on rents. We're seeing an impact on housing prices. So the price of houses also being driven up by this increase in people. We're seeing an impact on hospital waiting lists. We're seeing an impact to some extent on crime levels as well. Crime levels have increased in recent years. And it would be naive to think that there is no relation with the new people coming in. Now, I'm not saying it's totally due to that. Of course, there's plenty of Irish people doing crime as well. Of course, that's obvious. But the increase in crime in recent years is a serious worry. And it would be very naive or foolish to not think that there's no link between the increase in the population, and much of that increase is coming from migrants coming in year on year, and we're talking about 50,000 new migrants per year. So it's something that we need to take note of. So the multinationals were a big part of these changes in Ireland. Now, since about the late 90s into the early 2000s, the corporate tax rate of Ireland was driven down to 12.5%, resulting in ever more multinationals coming to Ireland. Now, while this does provide plenty of jobs and a boost to the economy, of course, and GDP goes up, there's a concern here, and that is that over 60% of the new jobs created in Ireland since 2004 are going to non-Irish. Now, some people don't care about that. Some people think that's fine. That's all well and good. And in one sense it is. But the problem with all of this is that what's essentially happening then is we are creating a job market. We are creating new jobs predominantly for non-Irish people. So you're going to get this kind of magnet effect. Ireland becomes this kind of place which is very attractive to immigrants. But you need to ask yourself, is this really what Ireland is about? Does Ireland purely exist as an economic commodity, which is open to the world and which allows the majority of our new jobs to be taken by migrants rather than Irish people? Is this really such a good thing? Shouldn't your first priority be to the people of Ireland? Would that not be a wise thing? I would say so, and I would think any country should have its own citizens as its number one priority. And then after that, once you've looked after Irish citizens, okay, fine, now you start to look after people from other countries as well, people who've come in from abroad, fair enough. But your first priority should always be to your own citizens. That's just common sense, Now, another part of all this is that the multinationals act as a springboard for introducing social change into Ireland. Okay, so in recent years, we're talking about the likes of gay marriage and abortion in particular. And, all of this benefits the multinational sector because, they generally are very liberal, and they tend to drive this kind of narrative of liberalism. And, you'll often see the rainbow flag on the corporations. You'll see them involved with gay pride, for instance. They also have a kind of an interest in driving abortion as well because, it suits multinationals. It suits big business in Ireland to not have women, going off on maternity leave. So if abortion is freely available to the women that work for them, well then they don't have to pay for that maternity leave, and they don't have to pay for those women when they're out of work. So there is a vested interest there in multinationals to drive this social change And like I said, the most obvious effects of that in recent years have been the gay marriage referendum and the abortion referendum, which both came in recent years. But to be fair, it's not just the multinationals. We also have these very wealthy philanthropic, in inverted commas, foundations, the likes of the Open Society, Atlantic Philanthropies, and these organisations are pumping huge amounts of money into Ireland, and they have started doing that particularly about 10 years ago. They began pumping in this money into Ireland, and this really helped to create the conditions for changing Ireland at a social level. So this is social engineering what's going on here, really, you know. And like I said, we've seen the effects of that in terms of gay marriage and abortion being given the green light in recent years. Now I remember back in like 15 years ago, 15 years ago, there was almost zero push for gay marriage. There wasn't much push for abortion either. But, excuse me, with the help of billions of euro and billions of dollars, you can change the climate, you can change the landscape. Social media, propaganda, you can get the media on board, you can get politicians on board, and this is what happened. And this is how these foundations, these organizations, and with the help of multinationals too, of course, they began to change the narrative. They began to change the information ordinary people are receiving, and in so doing, they helped to lay the groundwork. They helped to lay the ground for introducing these quite radical social changes of gay marriage and abortion into Ireland. Now let's look a little bit further on again on the implications of these changes to Ireland, these social changes, and particularly these demographic changes to Ireland in recent decades. So basically, Ireland's employers have now become very reliant on this cheaper foreign labour. The fact that we now have access to global labour, people from all over the world. Is this a good thing or not? Well, let's have a look at it. We now have, well, we always had to an extent, but it's getting worse. We have overstretched public services. That's very clear. Our homeless problem is getting worse and worse. The housing situation, there is definitely a need for more houses and apartments to be built. We have rents which are going through the roof, particularly in Dublin and its cities. And it's just getting worse and worse, And this situation is made ever worse by the fact that we're open to people coming in from all over, basically. And that's not to be negative about the migrants themselves. The migrants are just availing of the system. They're availing of the fact that they can come in, that they are allowed to come in. So it's not their fault. Rather, it's the very open, liberal system that Ireland is participating in, where we are essentially open to the world. And this means that, like I said, we have over 50,000 people coming in per year now. This places a stress on our public services, on our housing market. It increases rents. It allows the exploitation of migrants. Okay, like situations where you got 20 Brazilians stuffed into one house, possibly paying 200, 250 euro a week to share a room with 10 others. Like, this is desperate. This is really bad for the migrants themselves. And what's worse is we have certain slumlords, landlords, who are participating in this and seem to be perfectly fine with exploiting these migrants. We can't allow this situation to continue. It also impacts on the health situation. We have a worsening health crisis. We've longer hospital waiting lists. You've got the obvious problem with having to build more and more infrastructure, and obviously you've got to build more houses and apartments to cater for this increasing population, which is mostly driven by migration, mostly driven by this 50,000 people coming in per year into Ireland. And it also impacts on our wildlife habitats. Every time you build a new road, you build a new housing development, you are taking away valuable green spaces, woods and trees and rivers and so on, and hedgerows and all that. All of that impacts on nature, on ecosystems. It's not good for the environment. And why on earth are the Green Party not talking about this? Why do the Green Party, why do Saoirse McHugh and Kieran Cuff and Eamon Ryan, why do they not care about this? the increase in Ireland's population year on year, mostly driven by immigration, is leading to a loss of ever more